Hi class, today we are looking at Lesson 5 of Chapter 3, How Did Economics Impact the People in the Southern Colonies? Let's take a look at our timeline first to start things out. We've got 1634, Lord Baltimore founds Maryland. 1640, first recorded case of slavery in Virginia. 1663, King Charles II grants proprietors land in Carolina. 1715, Yamasee War begins. 1732, James Oglethorpe founds Georgia. 1770, about 500,000 African slaves are living in the southern colonies. Let's take a look at the map. Again, we've got a map of the larger United States here, and this section right here in the square is this section right here. And here are our southern colonies: Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. An agricultural economy. Life in the rural southern colonies differed sharply from life in the colonies to the north. The South provided the ideal environment for crops like rice, cotton, tobacco, and indigo. This was due to its rich soil, high humidity, and long growing season. However, the production of these crops required large areas of land and intense labor. During the colonial period, the primary function of a colony was to produce raw goods for the mother country, England. The mother country would then, in turn, ship back to the colonies finished products. The original 13 colonies lacked valuable resources like gold. What they could offer were agricultural goods. For New England and the middle colonies, this initially meant lumber and non-cash crops such as wheat. For the southern colonies, it meant cash crops like tobacco and cotton. As the colonies grew, demand for domestic goods grew faster than Britain could keep up with. In response, the northern colonies began producing more valuable finished goods such as furniture, iron, and ships. Meanwhile, Southerners became more adept at producing cash crops. In time, finding the labor needed to produce crops like cotton and tobacco became a difficult problem for the southern colonies. Virginia and Maryland. Starting with the Jamestown settlement, Virginia was the first colony in the American South. As Virginia's population grew, new settlements appeared west and north of the James River. This rich land was called the Tidewater. The Tidewater, a 75-mile wide strip of Virginia's coast, often flooded. Despite the presence of salt water, the land is fertile. Settlers were able to make money growing tobacco. By the 1700s, the colony's population was 70,000. In Virginia, the Church of England, also called the Anglican Church, was the established church of the colony. An established church is the official church of a nation or state. In Virginia, this meant that everyone had to pay a tax to the Anglican Church, even if they worshipped in another church. In contrast to Virginia, Maryland was founded for religious reasons. In 1632, George Calvert, Lord Baltimore of England, decided to create a community especially for Roman Catholics. King Charles I granted Calvert land north of Virginia on which to start a colony. Calvert named the new colony Maryland in honor of the king's wife, Queen Henrietta Maria. George Calvert died before he could visit the colony. As a result, his son Cecilius became the second Lord Baltimore. Cecilius decided to stay in England to make sure that the king continued to support a separate colony of Maryland. He sent his brother, Leonard Calvert, to Maryland in his place. Lord Leonard Calvert became the first governor of Maryland. In 1634, Lord Calvert, along with about 300 colonists, arrived at St. Clement's Island in Maryland. Calvert bought a village from the Yokomoco, a group of American Indians. The village became known as St. Mary's City. Calvert promised to trade fairly with the Yokomoco and to protect them from their enemies. On the land that the Yokomoco cleared, the Maryland colonists and slaves planted corn and tobacco. As the colony grew, Maryland colonists, like those in Virginia, discovered the profitability of selling tobacco to England. By the late 1600s, plantations, large farms that grew one crop, lined many of the creeks and rivers of Maryland. Chesapeake Bay had a harbor that was deep enough for large ships to use. This made it easy to transport goods to other colonies and to England. Most of the settlers who came to Maryland from England were Catholic. Many of Maryland's other settlers, however, came from Virginia and were members of the Church of England. Soon, Anglicans in Maryland outnumbered the Catholics. This meant that Catholics might have faced persecution. Fortunately, Maryland's charter, the Maryland Toleration Act, passed in 1649, protected them. This protection did not extend to Jews or to all Christians, but it was a significant stepping stone towards religious freedom in the colonies. And this is a picture of George Calvert, Lord Baltimore. The Carolinas and Georgia. England kept adding to its North American colonies. The new King Charles II set his sights on land south of Virginia. In 1663, he gave a charter to 8 proprietors. 7 years later, they founded their first settlement, the port city of Charlestown. From the beginning, Carolina had 2 regions. In the southern part of Charlestown's natural harbor, warm climate and natural resources made it a center for agriculture and trade. The southern part of Carolina also had large areas of low marshy land ideal for growing rice. Wealthy colonists built plantations outside the city. There they grew tobacco, rice, and indigo, a plant used to make blue dye. Colonists who settled in northern Carolina grew tobacco and sold forest products such as timber and tar. The economy in northern Carolina grew slowly due primarily to the lack of a good harbor, which made trade difficult. By the 1729, the differences between colonial life in the North and in the South resulted in the colony splitting into North Carolina and South Carolina. For years, the Tuscaroras had lived in northern Carolina's coastal plain. They were an agricultural tribe related to the Iroquois. The colonists had a habit of cheating the Tuscareros in trade deals and moving in on their land. Tensions erupted in 1711 when Chief Hancock, a Tuscarora leader, killed a local surveyor. A surveyor is someone who determines land boundaries. The chief believed the surveyor had stolen Tuscarora land when he measured the boundaries. The Tuscaroras then attacked the settlement in the disputed area, named New Bern, killing more than 130 people. The colony's government sent troops to attack the Tuscaroras and forced them to surrender in 1713. Similarly, conflicts arose with the Yamasee, a tribe that had once been an ally to North Carolina. The Yamasee claimed the colonists owed them money. With a large army, the Yamasee attacked the colonists in 1716. With the help from the Cherokees, however, the colonists eventually defeated the Yamasee in 1717. And at the bottom here, we have a picture of a rice field. Life in the southern colonies. Most southern colonists lived on small farms with their families. Southern colonists who had once been indentured servants often ended up owning smaller farms. Every family member worked to keep the farm running. Religion was an important part of colonists' lives. Because colonists spent most of their time working, they often combined work with play. An entire community, for example, would get together to build houses for newly married people. Colonists held plowing and corn husking competitions. At quilting bees, neighbors sewed together pieces of cloth to make a bedspread. When they were not helping their parents, children played with simple toys such as balls, dolls, marbles, kites, and jump rope. In the evening, families often read books aloud, played music, or sang together. Those who owned plantations, especially large plantations, lived a wealthy lifestyle. They hired workers or used slaves to keep the plantation running. Large plantation owners had great influence on government. Their view that the economy of the South would suffer without slaves was widely accepted in the region. Large plantations were like small villages. Plantations often had a flour mill, a blacksmith, and a carpenter's shop. The planter's family lived in the center of the plantation. in a section called the Big House. Most plantations of the 1700s, however, were much smaller than the one shown in the diagram, with the average planter owning about 20 slaves. Male family members helped the planter manage the land and crops. The women worked to feed and care for everyone on the plantation. Most children on plantations were educated at home. And this here is a drawing of a plantation in the southern colonies. An inhumane system. The type of work assigned to slaves depended on the economy of the colony in which they lived. In the North, many of the slaves worked in New England's busy shipyards. In Rhode Island and New York, slaves did farm work. It was rare for a Northerner to own more than one slave. Northern farms were small, and it was not profitable to use large numbers of slaves there. Southern farms, on the other hand, were often huge and grew cash crops. The major cash crop of the southern colonies in the 1600s was tobacco. Both rice and tobacco required many workers to plant, tend, and harvest the crop. Most southern plantations had about 20 slaves. South Carolina was unusual. By 1720, slaves made up more than half of the population of the colony. The possibility of slave rebellions was a constant fear for colonial leaders. Leaders in states with large enslaved populations were especially concerned. In part, to ease those worries, colonies and later states wrote laws defining the status of slaves and the rights of their owners. These laws were called slave codes. The purpose of slave codes was to place harsh restrictions on slaves and give owners absolute power over them. The slave codes varied from colony to colony. Most prevented the slaves from learning to read and write. Most states also prevented them from leaving the plantation without permission, testifying in court, or gathering together without a white person being present. Slaves had been kidnapped, forced to work, separated from their families, and punished harshly. Slaves resisted their situation by slowing their work, running away, and on occasion rebelling violently. Despite the hardships they suffered through, slaves managed to build a culture. They orally passed down African traditions, introduced African words into the English language, and told stories to their children to teach them about life. They also created many work songs and spirituals that are still sung to this day. And this is a photograph of a slave auction block. Primary source, in their own words. African slaves. Slaves working in the fields often sang work songs to relieve their boredom and to take their minds off their exhaustion. These songs sometimes had a call and response structure in which one person sang a verse and the others responded with a chorus. Many lyrics featured Christian themes in dialect or language that is specific to a region or group of people. The songs often focused on the peace and relief that a person could find in the afterlife. Here are lyrics for two songs sung by slaves in the South. I don't feel weary. Here's the chorus. I don't feel weary and no ways tired. Oh, glory, hallelujah. Here are the verses. Just let me in the kingdom where the world is all on fire. Oh, glory, hallelujah. Going to live with God forever while the world is all on fire. Oh, glory, hallelujah. And keep the ark a-moving while the world is all on fire. Oh, glory, hallelujah. And this is in mansions above. Chorus. Good Lord in the mansions above. Good Lord in the mansions above. My Lord, I hope to meet my Jesus in the mansions above. Here are the verses. If you get to heaven before I do, tell my Jesus I'm a-comin' too. To the mansions above. My Lord, I've had many trials here below. My Lord, I hope to meet you in the mansions above. Fight on, my brother, for the mansions above, for I hope to meet my Jesus there in the mansions above. The triangular trade and slavery, England, Africa, and the Americas. A triangular trade is the term used to describe the trade routes between England, Africa, and the Americas during the 1700s. Ship owners wanted their ships to carry cargo on every voyage so they could cover the cost of travel. The triangular trade was designed for traders to sell products and pick up cargo at each stop. In the first stage, the ships left from England left bound for West Africa. The ships carried goods such as guns, cloth, ironware, and rum, all made in England. Upon reaching the African coast, these goods were traded for African men, women, and children kidnapped by slave traders or purchased from African chiefs. In the second stage, European traders bought African slaves. Family members were separated. Traders held slaves until a ship appeared. Traders then sold the slaves to a European or African captain. The captain went through the long process of filling the ship. When the ship was filled, the middle passage, the journey to the Caribbean islands or North America began. The journey was horrific. Many Africans died. Some committed suicide. In the Americas, slaves were sold at auctions to the highest bidders. 2/3 of African slaves were taken to the Americas. With the money made from the sale of slaves, goods such as sugar, cotton, and tobacco were purchased in North America and the Caribbean islands and shipped back to England for sale. And here's a map showing this. So we have the red is trade from Africa, purple, trade from the colonies, green, trade from Europe, and the yellow arrows is trade from the West Indies. We have the manufactured goods leaving England, such as guns, cloth, and iron, going to Africa, where they then traded with gold, spices, ivory, hardwoods, and of course the enslaved Africans. They then sold those and traded them for sugar, molasses, and other things such as whale oil, lumber, furs, rice, indigo, tobacco, sugar, molasses, wood, which then they took back to England and sold. The 13 colonies then and now. The United States has steadily grown in population since the Constitution was ratified in 1788. Historians estimate that around 4 million people lived in the United States in 1790. In 2015, the nation had a population of over 320 million. The maps in this section will allow you to investigate some of the changes that occurred in the 2 centuries since the writing of the Constitution. So on this side here, we have the states, the original 13 colonies, and over here, we have the map showing where they are. The green is the original 13 colonies. The dashed line there is the proclamation line of 1763. This is the red line is the colony boundaries, and this gray line is the present day boundaries, which in some cases is going to be very similar to the original colony boundaries. On this page here, go ahead and we're going to pause the video, and you can take a look at the populations in 1790 versus the populations in 2015. And then the stop and check says, think about the 13 colonies map and the information for each state, and note which states have different capitals than they had in 1778. And think about what reasons might a state have for moving its capital. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit so we can see it better. All right, boys and girls, as always, I hope to see you soon.